and founding director of the Centre for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship at Bristol University. He's a world-renowned expert on race, religion, multiculturalism, racial and religious diversity. And given the pressure on his time, we're anxious to hear from him and not from me. So I'll leave you to read all about him after the meeting. But Professor Tarek, we're delighted to have you here, and can I hand the floor to you?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was being a little bit impatient. It's just that when I met Shanaz at a MCB anniversary dinner recently, she told me about this group, and I said, oh, I'd like to meet them. I'd like to present to them. And then she said, yes, and you can talk about X and Y. And then by email, she added A and B and so on. It kind of got to balloon outwards. And I realized that I couldn't do a presentation either in terms of proper length of time, due length of time, or coherence if I was to include everything that Shanaz mentioned. But what I have done is to include two of the core things. So I wanted to myself address issues about how we think about establishment in Britain today and equivalents or substitutions for establishments. It's a kind of a cluster of things. It's not just establishment or disestablishment. But Shanaz was aware that I've just recently finished leading a very large multi-continental project looking at something similar, looking at the governance of religious diversity, called Greece. The project was called Greece, as in the film, not in the country. And she said, you must tell us about that. So I've included some of that. And in fact, it's a reasonably good platform that we can use to then talk about, you know, the things that are most of immediate concern to us in Britain. But it does mean that it just takes a little bit more time to give you something meaningful from the Greece project. So that's why I was kind of hurrying. And I've come up with this title to connect these two things, as you can see. And the talk is really based on two recent papers. This is the first one. So Thomas Seeley worked with me as a research associate, as a research assistant on the Greece project. And, you know, we developed a approach together, and I'm going to share some of that approach with you now. So this is the first article the talk's based on. So I'm sure you're aware that over the last couple of decades, there's a lot of rethinking going on in different parts of the world, certainly including Britain and Western Europe, on political secularism, and specifically rethinking political secularism in the light of a new religious diversity, a multi-faith diversity. And I won't tell you about what other people have said in this debate. There isn't any time and so on, but it's a debate across many different academic fields, let alone public constituencies, you know, not just political theory, but theology and sociology, even policies and so on. But I come to it in my own way and in a fairly distinctive way. So I begin with a definition of political secularism, which is on this slide. And it emphasizes political autonomy as being the central feature of political secularism, by which I mean that politics or the state has a raison d'etre of its own and should not be subordinated to religious authority, religious purposes, or religious reasons. And if you like, that is the kind of minimal, I mean, it's a very thin definition of political secularism. it's very baseline or minimalist, as I call it. And the advantage of that is that it covers a larger range of cases. For example, other people tend to define political secularism in terms of things like religious freedom. Well, I think that's no good, because surely we'd all agree that the Soviet Union was a secularist state, or the People's Republic of China is a secularist state. Who would deny that? And yet there's no religious freedom, or very limited religious freedom, in those two political entities. So we mustn't smuggle in liberal understandings of secularism into our definition of political secularism, because then we're not talking about the full range of possible cases in the world. And so I prefer to think in terms of multiple secularism rather than just privileging a particular kind of West European version. But I do, and then we can use the minimalist definition that's on the slide to build up a variety of secularist polities or secularist states. And by secularist, I'm really here thinking about how state and religion connect. You will have seen in my title, State Religion Connections, or as I call them, SRCs. So I'm not just talking about establishment, I'm talking about any and every kind of state religion connections. And there isn't a single state in the world that doesn't have any. Even, the People's Republic of China, and certainly includes places that we think of as radically secularist like France, has many state religion connections. And so we elaborate those contextually. So we capture the variety without reducing them to a single template or a limited number of templates. And then underneath at the bottom, I've got, to their political autonomy can be added what some people have called, well, I think I've called mutual autonomy. That is to say, not simply that politics shouldn't be subordinated to religion, but also the other way around. Religion shouldn't be subordinated to politics. But this is a distinctive kind of secularism. I actually call it moderate secularism. And it is the secularism that is the most prevalent version in Western Europe, especially in Northwestern Europe. But it's not the minimalist definition of secularism, because, as I say, there are lots of other kinds that don't do this. So we may be interested in the secularism of mutual autonomy, because that's our world, that's our polity. But as an academic and theorist, I need to theorize across all possible cases. And so this is what we do in this project that I mentioned, Greece. We looked at Europe, West, Central, and East. We looked at the MENA region, South Asia and Southeast Asia, and Australia, altogether 23 countries. And so what I'm about to present to you as a kind of simplified typology, in my opinion, covers all those 23 cases. So let's begin with that. I think we can cover all those 23 countries by looking at 5 different modes of secularism, or specifically modes of governance of religious diversity. One that you won't see in the 5 is what we might call theocracy or something. Now that's partly, well, largely actually, none of our 23 countries, including all the ones that we looked at in the MENA region, would fit such a category. So we didn't include Iran, which is probably, the main country in the world that would be quite squarely a theocratic country. But let me start explaining these 5 different modes. Hopefully they'll become recognizable to you. So there are 3 on this slide. The first one we call majoritarian nationalism. What do we mean by that? Well, we mean these key features And not every example has to have all the key features. And any one case, whether it's Egypt or Britain or Norway, can be a mix across cases as well. But nevertheless, we think that we can analyze a particular mode by having these analytical features listed. So majoritarian nationalism consists of a strong state identification with one religion. In radical cases, the state actually takes over or controls the religious institutions and followers of one or more religions. A very good example of that is the Diyanet in Turkey. Or the state may come to be controlled by religious parties. And again, Turkey has become an example of that, though it didn't used to be, with the AKP, Erdogan's party, since about 2013, becoming increasingly authoritarian and not so much as opening the space for greater Muslim participation in public life, but taking hold of what it is to be Muslim, in particular, taking control of Sunni Islam through the Diyanet, but also in other ways as well, controlling universities, for instance. Another example would be, say, Muslim Brotherhood, which briefly had control of the Egyptian state. So that's what we mean by majoritarian nationalism. And most of the countries of the MENA region actually fall into that category. But also, there are countries in Europe which are actually headed in that direction as well, whether they have fully got there or not. Countries like perhaps Hungary or Slovakia. Our next category or mode we call secularist statism. And there are relatively few examples of that out of our 23. But let me give you the details first. Two main features identified there: state control of religion, and that the state excludes religion from the political and the civic, and finding religious freedom largely to the private sphere. And I hope that rings a bell with you in relation to French laïcité, because French laïcité is actually the best example we have of secularist statism. There was a time, say 25 years plus ago, when you could have said that Turkey was also approximating to this mode of state-religion connections, secularist statism. But now, Turkey, in the last decade or so, has definitely moved from 2 to 1, bearing in mind that no state has to be perfectly matching every detail, because obviously the world is more messy than any categorization. The third mode of governance is one where moral individualism is at the core, and in particular, freedom of conscience. Now, this isn't the only mode where freedom of conscience is at the core. You could say freedom of conscience is also very important in France. I wouldn't deny that. They're less willing to accept freedom of practice, what they call freedom to manifest your religion, as it's understood in the European Convention of Human Rights. But certainly freedom of conscience, I think, is strongly supported in France, but also in this liberal neutralism. But liberal neutralism differs from something like secular statism in a number of ways. It is anti-assimilation. It doesn't require people to assimilate to a particular culture or religious culture, let alone a religion. And it says that all religions should be of equal civic standing. And it allows the state and other actors in civil society to engage in what I've called active de-othering. What I mean by that is challenging the stereotyping of groups, religious groups. like Muslims, for instance. So where a group is othered, it's treated as, oh, you're not really part of us. You are something else, and this something else is problematic. You are an other, a radical other. But in the liberal neutralism version, you don't have any recognition. Now, I don't know how familiar this concept of recognition is to you. It's very important in multiculturalist political theory. One of the people who's publicized it most in that theorizing is the Canadian political philosopher, Catholic political philosopher, Charles Taylor. But recognition, very, very briefly, is accepting another group of people, religious or non-religious group of people, in terms of their own identity, recognizing their difference, recognizing that they have a sense of themselves that they would like to live by, and they would like others to accept and respect. Respect in certain ways, respect in terms of citizenship respect, not respect in the sense that you have to endorse it. So, you know, I would say most Muslims in Britain want to be recognized as Muslims, but they're not looking for other people to say, oh, you know, Islam is the true religion. That's not what recognition is, or recognition or respect. Not that. It is not an endorsement of what you believe or what you practice. It's recognizing its presence and the legitimacy of its presence. That you belong here, you belong to Britain no less than anybody else, as it were, despite your differences. So liberal neutralism doesn't do that. No recognition, because liberal neutralism wants a minimal role for the state, active de-othering, but other people, civil society can recognize people, but the state doesn't want to. And to be quite honest, very few of our 23 countries came anywhere close to liberal neutralism. And yet, if you read any political theory or read any in the last couple of decades, most Western liberal political theorists say that their understanding of secularism, you know, their ideal is this, that the state should be neutral between all religions. I think this is an impossible ideal, and I'm not even in favor of it if we could have it, but we actually don't have it, and we didn't really find it existing in our sample of 23 countries, which of course includes Britain, includes all of Europe, most of Europe anyway. So turning to the remaining two modes of governance of religious diversity. I don't know what happened to number 4 anyway. I've come to number 5 and 6, but don't worry. I think it's just a numbering issue. So this one I call moderate secularism, a term I've made up myself. Other people have other names for it. So the former Archbishop of Canterbury, oh gosh, his name's
Dr. Owen Williams.
Yes, Dr. Owen Williams, now head of a Cambridge college. He has something that he calls procedural secularism that he's in favor of, which overlaps with what I call moderate secularism. My main difference with Rowan Williams' concept is that I don't think this is confined to the procedural. It is actually a substantive form of secularism, because there are various policies, like, for instance, the support of religious schools, faith schools, you know, out of the public purse, a very substantial fiscal investment by the state in religious organizations. That's not a procedure, that's very substantive. But anyway, leaving aside what other people call it, I call it moderate secularism. And here are its 5 key features. So the moral individualism and freedom of conscience that I've already referred to, and which, as you will recall, I said exists in more than one of these modes. Religions may enjoy equal or unequal status, but all are officially and socially tolerated. So can you see that this is different from what I was calling liberal neutralism? Because liberal neutralism was that all religions must enjoy equal civic status, whereas in moderate secularism, they may do or they may not do. Religion is seen as a public good in need of support. Again, quite different from liberal neutralism, which says, well, people are free to practice any religion that they want, but they shouldn't look to the state for any kind of support. This is very different. And this idea of a public good is very important to moderate secularism, and why religion is not treated as simply a matter of private benefit or private pursuit. Religion might also be seen as in need of regulation. For example, social attitudes that undermine tolerance and respect for religion and religious diversity may need to be regulated. So again, it's not a neutralist state. It's not a hands-off state. If there is, hate speech or various kinds of conflict going on between different religious groups, we can choose any that we want. The state doesn't just say, well, that's okay, we don't mind, as long as no laws are broken. Obviously, if there are criminal actions, like, say, vandalizing a church or a mosque, yes, that's different. But the state may just be neutral about the proliferation of those attitudes, the growth of those attitudes. Whereas in my moderate secularism, the state is not neutral because it wants to constrain what would be destructive attitudes of the kind of stability and harmony that it's trying to maintain. So again, you can see it differs quite a lot from liberal theory. And finally, I've got to what I mentioned before, mutual autonomy. Because in moderate secularism, we do have, if not perfectly, very largely a mutual autonomy. Not only does the state require religions to not interfere in matters of state, except where, as it were, there's a provision for them to do so. But it's the state that decides that. But the other way around, the state does not interfere in people's religious beliefs, in the organizations, the associations of faith, like, churches or religious movements and so on. And that's why we call it mutual autonomy. Now, we largely have that in Britain, I think. Not 100%, there are some limits on each side, but we largely have mutual autonomy. And that's clearly not, therefore, neutrality, but quite large amounts of neutrality. That's why I've got here restricted neutrality, and including what I've got here, what I call, which some of you may not think is a very flattering description, but it's meant to be a kind of sociological description, weak establishment, which is what I think we have in Britain. I call it weak establishment. Some other people, some other theorists call it symbolic establishment. I don't think symbolic is enough. When bishops are sitting in the House of Lords passing legislation, that's not symbolic. So I think it's not right to say that the UK has a symbolic establishment. I prefer to say we have weak establishment, because it's absolutely clear that power lies with the House of Commons, that power lies with the secular framework, and religious organizations, specifically the Church of England, are accommodated within that framework in a limited way. So that's why it's a weak establishment. And there is unequal recognition, by which I mean that the kind of recognition that the Church of England has, the Church of Scotland doesn't, and the kind of recognition the Church of Scotland has, Muslims don't, Jews don't, Hindus don't, and so on. So we have unequal recognition. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we're going to get onto in a minute, but this is what we actually have. So these are descriptive categories, that the categories created in order to make sense of the world as it is, the different kinds of state-religion connections that exist. And very quickly, I'll turn to the last one, pluralistic nationalism, or a kind of unity in diversity nationalism. I've got in brackets here that it can become a form of communalism where the national citizenship framework is weak or allows one community to dominate the others. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But its main features are a difference-sensitive identity recognition. So in this framework, people's religious identity is highly recognized, certainly highly recognized relative to the other four modes. And therefore, there's also institutional accommodation of religious diversity, not just of one or a limited number of religions, but of religious diversity. An American, well, actually he was British, but working in American theorist who passed away a couple of years ago, called this mode respect all, I respect all religions, positive cooperation. There should be positive cooperation between different religious groups, but also between religious groups and the state, and principled distance. That is to say, the state shouldn't favor one group or groups, a limited number of groups, and disfavor others. It may have different relations with them, but those relations, insofar as they are differential, must be on a principled basis. That's what he means by principled distance. And I'll come on to that in a certain kind of way in a few moments. Turning to the fourth bullet point in that last bit of the slide, religion is active and present in public and political life. And you might say, well, where are we talking about in the world? So I would say that really there were only 2 countries in our sample of 23 that approximated to this, and they were India and Indonesia. But I'll say a little bit more about them. But Alfred Stepan, who's the British theorist working at Columbia University and then passed away recently, he also included Senegal as an example of this mode, of this pluralistic nationalism. There's policy cooperation, and therefore people can give religious reasons in the political sphere. Again, this is something that a lot of liberal political theorists disapprove of. They say religious people may participate in political debates about, whatever issues they choose to, but they must speak a secular language because they must be intelligible to people who do not share their faith. I think that's too severe a restriction on religious people. And in this model, you don't need them. You don't have that restriction. There's the model is accommodative of differentiated legal status and religious personal laws. That is the case, for instance, in India, where there's Muslim personal law supported by the constitution. Other groups, other religions also have some religious personal laws, but the Muslim one is the most extensive. And there's primacy of group autonomy and social support for deep diversity. And you notice that it's the group that's getting all the attention and the support here, not the individual conscience, but the group membership and the autonomy and support for the group. Now, what has been happening in the last 10 to 20 years is that countries that might have prior to that been said to be approximating to this mode of governance, this mode of secularism, I mentioned India and Indonesia as part of our sample, they have unfortunately been moving away. And that's why I've got that stuff about communalism in brackets on the left-hand side in blue, because none of these modes is static. I said to you earlier how Turkey had moved away from a kind of secularist statism to a kind of majoritarian nationalism. So what we are finding in countries like Indonesia, but above all in India at the moment, is a very fast move away from this mode, my fifth mode, though it's numbered 6 here, and they're actually moving towards number 1, to majoritarian nationalism. And the depressing thing is that in many ways, if we look across the world, across our 23 countries, that is probably the strongest trend in these 23 countries. Insofar as there's a movement, and as I say, no country is static, stasis is impossible. There's always some movement in some direction or other. At the moment, for people like me, who self-describe themselves as a multiculturalist and so on, this is a very depressing finding. The dominant trend across the world is in the direction of majoritarian nationalism. So that's my 5 modes of secularism that we found applying to our 23 countries. And we can come back to that in the discussion if you like. But I'd now like to try and get to a point where we can have a discussion about, well, the things that concern us in Britain. So I'll move on to my second paper. Remember I said this talk was based on 2 papers. So this is the second one, the multidimensional recognition of religion that I did with Simon Thompson in that journal. So Simon Thompson and I have been working together for a while. And in our previous work, we've argued that state religion connections, SRCs, specifically establishment, and here we include the Anglican establishment, though other establishments as well. Establishment is wrong if it causes alienation. So if a group in the population, a group of citizens, like Jews or Muslims, say, the privileged framework offered to Christians or Anglicans makes us feel that we're not accepted as equal citizens, and we feel alienated from Britain as a result, then establishment is wrong and something should be done about it. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to have disestablishment, but we identify it as a problem. If it causes minority alienation, there is a problem that must be addressed. Secondly, we say here, this problem could be addressed by contributing, this is where establishment contributes to othering. So the othered group feels alienated. So as we all know, there's, Islamophobia in British society, a lot of Muslims are already suffering it. If some people then turn around and say, well, this is a Christian country, you don't really belong here. That's how establishment could, not has to, but could contribute to othering. Establishment may, but again, does not necessarily cause such alienation, but it may cause such alienation, but it's not peculiar to establishment. I think the secularist regime in France causes more alienation to Muslims in France than anything comparable in Britain. In any case, then, it's important to determine in each particular case whether alienation is being caused or not. And we do so not by just turning to liberal political theory, which is quite a lot of what liberals do, but we do so in dialogue with minorities. That's one of the multiculturalist emphases, always dialogue across groups, cross-cultural or cross-faith dialogue. Liberals think you can just come up with any solution just by thinking, rationally thinking up a solution. I don't think that, and it's not part of multiculturalism. So the question then is, in bold at the bottom, how do we evaluate a status quo where there is one established religion in a multi-faith context? And let's, think very much about Britain. So what Simon and I have done in the paper that I'm talking about now, so, this was our previous work, but the paper now, is that we offer two principles that should be observed when a state relates to different faith communities. Our first principle we call principle of identification. The state should strive to enable citizens to identify with their political community. Notice straight away the verb strive. So this is an active verb. The state has to do something. So this is not compatible with liberal neutralism. The state isn't hands-off. It doesn't back away. It tries to achieve a certain goal, namely that all citizens, whether they be Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, agnostics, whatever, should identify with their political community. Not everybody will accept this as an important goal, but this is what we think. Such identification is good for both intrinsic and instrumental reasons. Intrinsically, because citizens benefit from being able to identify with their political community. We think that citizens feel good about themselves and in communion with others, in association, concert with others, if they together are able to identify with their political community. It's good for individuals to feel that they are part of that community. Secondly, the instrumental reason. If they can all do so, have that identification, it's easier for certain goals to be achieved. Goals to do with public order, civil peace, security, and anti-extremism. Obviously, if no group in the population is feeling it doesn't identify with being British, there'll be far less scope for the spread of extremist ideas or radicalized ideas or anti-British ideas. So that's our first principle, identification. I said there were two principles, so I'll turn straight away to the second. This we call principle of discretionary recognition, because we argue that the first principle, identification, is an absolute obligation on the state. And it applies to all citizens and therefore to all religious groups within the polity. But the state, the state must do that. That's the first level. That's the sine qua non. It must do that. But it can do more than that as well. It can't do less than that, but it can do more than that. And what this more is what this slide is about. A state may give additional recognition to one or more religions. That is to say, it may do recognition above that level required for identification. Do you see what I mean there? So the state must do whatever is necessary so that all groups identify with the political community or their country, identify with Britain. But even having achieved that, in relation to one or more groups, like say Christians or Muslims or anybody else, the state may do more than is required for identification. Why? Well, a variety of reasons may be given for such discretionary recognition. And we highlight in bold here reasons that may be offered. For instance, someone might say, well, look, the Anglican Church has a historic importance for what it is to be British, for there to be a country called England and Britain. Therefore, it's not unwarranted to give something extra to the Church of England, which we don't give to other people. Or they may say it has a certain significance, not just historically, but for contemporary identity. Of course, it's not just one. It may choose two. It may say Anglican and Catholic or Anglican and Jew or whatever, but whatever it is, it's differential recognition. Or it may say, actually, this church makes an enormous contribution to the welfare of our country through what it offers through schools, through its charitable institutions, its neighborhood networks, its caring for the elderly, and so on and so on. And that's why we give it this additional recognition, which may be symbolic, or it may consist of resources. We'll give you some extra resources so you can do your good work, or it can be both or whatever. And at the bottom of that slide, we give an example of the Finnish Orthodox Church, which you may or may not be familiar with. So this is actually the Russian Orthodox Church in Finland, and it has a very small membership out of the population of Finland today. You know, like 3 or 4% or less, you know, tiny. But what's interesting is it enjoys recognition as an established church, just like the Lutheran Church of Finland, which is the majority church. And you think, well, isn't it crazy? If only 1 or 2 or 3% follow the Finnish Orthodox Church, why should it be given state recognition, which it has been given? And of course, it was given it for historical reasons. And the Finns aren't too worried about that. They don't feel, oh, this should now be taken away. Obviously, in the light of Putin and Ukraine and so on, they may come to reassess that. But at the moment, the Finnish Orthodox Church enjoys state recognition, which some other religions don't. The Catholic Church doesn't, for reasons of historical importance. And so they meet our principle of discretionary recognition. Lexical priorities is probably a phrase not familiar to you unless you are a political theorist. So lexical refers to words that we find in a dictionary, because they're always in alphabetical order, aren't they? And when they're all under G, GA goes before, you know, GE or whatever. So they always follow a certain precedence, priority. So we say that our two principles have a lexical priority. The first principle must always be observed before the second. So discretionary recognition is impermissible if it threatens identification. Because whenever you have more than one principle, they can clash. And we're saying where there's a clash, obviously we do whatever we can to avoid the clash. But if necessary, we may have to give up on discretionary recognition because we must observe the principle of identification first. But we don't think that granting discretionary recognition necessarily undermines identification. That's not our view. We're just saying if it should undermine it or threaten to undermine it, then the problem has to be addressed. And one of the solutions to the problem might be that we just say, sorry, folks, we can't have discretionary recognition. Sorry, folks, we can't no longer have an established Anglican church, you know, just hypothetically speaking. So if and when the principle of discretionary recognition does undermine the principle of identification, it becomes illegitimate. But this should be established through democratic dialogue. It's not up to judges or the House of Lords or liberal political theorists. It's through democratic dialogue, including, of course, the minority faiths, that we establish whether they do feel their identification is being threatened by some discretionary recognition given to some and not to other faiths. And I think this is more or less my last slide. Just spell out, if it's not absolutely clear, just spell out some of the virtues of my position. All the things I've been saying to you are a matter of democratic debate. It's not a matter of theology, and it's not a matter of that it's in the gift of the state or the gift of the prime minister or whatever. All these things can be democratically debated. And therefore, it's compatible with, my position is compatible with, and so leaves open for debate the next bullet point, namely, mono establishment, like say the Anglican establishment in Britain today, or it could be multi-establishment. So I gave you the example of Finland, which has 2 established churches. In Alsace-Lorraine, for various historical reasons, they have 4 or 5 established churches or religions. And there's nothing to stop us having multi-establishment. Senegal has multi-establishment. But I'm not saying we have to have it. All I'm saying is it's open to democratic debate. My position leaves it open to democratic debate, or also no establishment. So it's not like we're committed to establishment. If democratically we came to the view that establishment was undermining identification, then as far as we're concerned, that would be a legitimate conclusion. So what's important to us is our principles, not whether there's mono-establishment, multi-establishment, or no establishment. All 3 are in principle compatible with our principles. So the matter is highly contextual. Next, what distinguishes us is that we do not hold either of these 2 positions, which actually in a knee-jerk way, quite a lot of people in this country hold, including academics. A, they say in a multicultural secular democracy, mono-establishment can never be justified. As you can see, our principles don't lead us to that conclusion. And some other people hold the view, in a multicultural secular democracy, differential recognition, whether that be symbolic, legally, or resource provision, can never be justified. And again, our 2 principles don't lead us to that conclusion. So it all depends on features such as historic importance, significance for identity, social contribution, and so on, all of which are matters open to public debate. They're not esoteric, they're not in some kind of theological language that secular people can't understand, and so on. But we can create, as it were, secular justifications for state religion connections, even for establishment privileges. But the important thing is that all the debate is open to the polity as a whole, and that everyone and anyone can participate. And just finally, to remind you, if you want to read in more detail, these are the 2 papers that I've been drawing on in this presentation.